I never thought a single email could destroy 15 years of marriage, but there I was at 3 a.m., staring at my phone screen with shaking hands, watching my entire world crumble with each word I read. The notification had come in at midnight, a work email from my boss. Nothing unusual about that. What was unusual was that my husband had already opened it, read it, and made a decision that would change both our lives forever. I'm Sarah, and until 3 months ago I thought I had the perfect life. A successful marketing career, a beautiful home in the suburbs, and a marriage that everyone envied. My husband David and I had been together since college. He was my first love, my best friend, the father of our 2 children. We shared everything. Our bank accounts, our dreams, our passwords. That last part would turn out to be the biggest mistake of my life. You see, David had always been the tech-savvy one in our relationship. He set up all our devices, managed our digital accounts, and insisted we share passwords for convenience. I never questioned it. Why would I? We trusted each other completely. Or so I thought. The night everything changed started like any other. I'd been working late on a major campaign pitch, finally crawling into bed around 11 p.m., exhausted. David was already asleep, or at least I thought he was. My phone was charging on the nightstand, and I'd set it to silent mode like I always did. I had no idea that exactly 12:07 a.m., an email would arrive that would expose the most devastating betrayal I could ever imagine. I woke up the next morning to find David already dressed and sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open and my phone in his hands. His face was pale, his jaw clenched in a way I'd never seen before. The coffee pot was full, but neither of us had touched it. The silence in the room was suffocating. "We need to talk," he said, his voice cold and distant. Those 4 words sent ice through my veins. In 15 years of marriage, David had never spoken to me like that, never looked at me with such. The disappointment, anger, I couldn't quite read his expression, but it terrified me. "About what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady as I poured myself coffee with trembling hands. I racked my brain trying to think of what could have upset him. Had I forgotten something important? An anniversary? A family event? That's when he slid my phone across the table. The screen was lit up, displaying an email from my boss, Richard Morrison. The subject line read, "Ray, our private discussion, urgent response needed." My heart stopped, not because of what the email said, I hadn't even read it yet, but because of the look of utter betrayal in my husband's eyes. In that moment, I realized that David had not only read my private correspondence, but had also jumped to conclusions that would poison everything we'd built together. 15 years, Sarah, he whispered, his voice breaking. 15 years I've loved you, trusted you, built a life with you. And this is how I find out. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands, my mind racing. What could Richard have possibly written that would cause this reaction? Richard was my boss, yes, but our relationship had always been strictly professional. Sure, we'd worked closely together on several major accounts, and yes, there had been late nights and business dinners, but there was nothing inappropriate about any of it. At least that's what I thought. As I scrolled through the email, my blood turned to ice. The words on the screen didn't match the reality I knew. They painted a picture of secret meetings, hidden agendas, and implications that made my stomach churn. But worse than the content of the email was the realization that my husband had read it first, had time to analyze it, to build a case against me in his mind before I even knew it existed. "David, this isn't what it looks like." I started, but he held up his hand to stop me. "Don't. Just don't. I need to think. I'm going to stay at my brother's for a few days." And just like that, he was gone. The front door slammed shut, leaving me alone with an email I still didn't fully understand, and a marriage that was already cracking at the foundation. What I didn't know then was that this was only the beginning. The real betrayal, the one that would nearly destroy me, was still waiting to be uncovered. I sat in my empty kitchen for hours after David left, reading and reading that email until the words blurred together. Let me tell you exactly what it said, because understanding this email is crucial to understanding how my life fell apart, and how I eventually put it back together again. The email was a response to something I had apparently sent Richard the day before. But here's the thing, I had no memory of sending any email to him that would warrant such a response. The timestamp showed I'd supposedly sent the original message at 20:30 a.m. the previous night, which was impossible because I'd been sound asleep next to David. Richard's response read, "Sarah, I've given serious thought to your proposal from last night. While I understand your frustrations with the current situation at home, I think we need to be very careful about how we proceed. What you're suggesting could have serious consequences for both of us. I've arranged for us to meet privately tomorrow evening at the Marriott downtown, room 412. We can discuss the details then and make our final decision. Please delete this email after reading." I stared at those words until they burned into my retinas. What proposal? What frustrations at home? What final decision? And most importantly, when had I supposedly sent him an email that would prompt such a response? I immediately opened my sent folder, my hands shaking as I scrolled through my recent emails. And there it was, sent at 20:30 a.m. the previous night from my account to Richard. "Richard, I can't take it anymore. David suspects something, and I think it's time we stop pretending. I'm ready to leave him if you're ready to make this official between us. I need to know where you stand because I can't keep living this lie. Meet me tomorrow and let's end this charade once and for all. Sarah." I read that email 3 times before the full horror of the situation hit me. Someone had sent that email from my account. Someone had deliberately crafted a message designed to make it look like Richard and I were having an affair. But who would do such a thing? And why? The more I thought about it, the more pieces started falling into place. David's behavior over the past few weeks suddenly made sense. He'd been distant, asking odd questions about my work schedule, checking his phone constantly, and insisting on helping me with my laptop more often than usual. I'd attributed it to stress from his own job, but now I was seeing a different picture. My husband, the man I trusted with everything, had been monitoring my digital communications. But it was worse than just spying. Someone had actually composed and sent that email from my account. The question was whether David was the victim of an elaborate setup, or if he was the one orchestrating it. I decided to call Richard directly. My hands were still shaking as I dialed his number, and when he answered, his voice was tense and uncomfortable. "Sarah, I was hoping you'd call. Listen, about that email you sent, I think we need to clear the air here." "Richard," I interrupted, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I did not send you that email. I was asleep at 20:30 a.m., and I would never, ever suggest what was written in that message." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Sarah, it came from your email address. Your personal email address, not your work one. How could someone else have sent it?" That's when the reality hit me like a physical blow. Whoever had done this had access to my personal email account. They knew my password, knew my writing style well enough to craft a believable message, and knew enough about my work relationship with Richard to make the whole scenario seem plausible. "Richard, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Has anyone else been asking questions about our work relationship? Anyone from the company? Anyone cut outside the company?" Another pause. "Well, actually, yes. About 2 weeks ago, your husband called me." My blood ran cold. "David called you. What did he say?" "He said he was planning a surprise party for your work anniversary and wanted to know about your schedule, what projects you were working on, who you worked most closely with." I thought it was sweet, actually. He seemed like such a caring husband. The pieces were falling into place now, and the picture they formed was more disturbing than I could have imagined. David hadn't called Richard about any surprise party. He'd been gathering intelligence, building a profile of my work relationships, looking for vulnerabilities he could exploit. But why? What could possibly motivate the man I'd loved for 15 years to orchestrate such an elaborate deception? What did he have to gain by destroying our marriage with fabricated evidence of an affair that didn't exist? I was about to find out that the answer was more shocking than anything I could have imagined. David's betrayal wasn't just about trust or jealousy or even money. It was about something much more sinister, something that would make me question everything I thought I knew about the man I'd married. As I sat there in my empty house, staring at that damning email chain, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to confront David directly. I wasn't going to beg him to believe my innocence. Instead, I was going to do some investigating of my own. If my husband could spy on me, could manipulate my digital communications, could orchestrate an elaborate frame job to make me look unfaithful, then he was capable of much more than I'd ever suspected. And I was going to find out exactly what he'd been hiding from me. I had no idea that what I was about to discover would make his email setup look like child's play. The next few days were the longest of my life. David was staying at his brother's house, refusing to take my calls and responding to my texts with single-word answers. Thinking. Space. Letter. Each message felt like a dagger to my heart, but I forced myself to stay focused on my investigation. I started with our shared laptop, the one David had set up for both of us to use. He'd always been the tech expert in our relationship, and I'd blindly trusted his configurations and recommendations. Now I was realizing how dangerous that trust had been. It took me 3 hours of searching through file directories and system logs to find what I was looking for. Hidden deep in a folder labeled System Backup Files was a collection of screenshots, saved conversations, and what appeared to be a detailed log of my digital activities going back almost 6 months. My husband had been monitoring everything. Every email I sent, every website I visited, every document I worked on. He had screenshots of my social media conversations, copies of my work presentations, and even records of my online shopping activities. It was a complete digital dossier of my life, compiled with the methodical precision of a private investigator. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I found in a subfolder labeled Project Planning. Inside were draft versions of the email that had been sent to Richard. Not just one draft, dozens of them. I could see David's thought process as he crafted the perfect message, tweaking the wording to sound like my voice, adjusting the tone to be just intimate enough to seem suspicious, but not so obvious that it would immediately be dismissed as fake. There were also notes. Handwritten notes that David had scanned and saved digitally. Pages and pages of observations about my work habits, my relationship with Richard, my schedule patterns. He'd been building a case against me for months, documenting every late night at the office, every business dinner, every text message I'd exchanged with colleagues. But why? What could possibly motivate someone to go to such elaborate lengths to frame their own spouse for infidelity? I was about to find out, and the answer would shake me to my core. In another folder, I found financial documents, bank statements, investment records, insurance policies, all things that should have been familiar to me since we supposedly shared everything. But these weren't our joint accounts. These were accounts I'd never seen before, opened in David's name only, containing amounts of money that made my head spin. Over the past 2 years, my husband had quietly accumulated nearly 800,000 in hidden assets. Money that had been systematically moved from our joint accounts, from his retirement fund, even from our children's college savings. He'd been planning something big, and he'd been planning it for a very long time. But where had all this money come from originally? David made good money as an IT consultant, but not this kind of money. I started digging deeper into his financial records, and what I found made my stomach turn. David had been embezzling from his clients. Small amounts at first, a few $100s here and there from company accounts he managed. But over time, the amounts had grown larger and more frequent. He developed an elaborate system of false invoicing, phantom contracts, and redirected payments that had allowed him to skim hundreds of thousands of dollars without detection. The beautiful life we'd built together, the house, the vacations, the private schools for our children, it had all been funded by stolen money. I'd been living a lie for years without even knowing it. But the financial fraud was just part of the picture. As I continued reading through David's files, I discovered the real reason behind his elaborate frame job. He'd been planning to divorce me and take everything. The fake affair was his insurance policy. In a document titled Exit Strategy, David had outlined his entire plan in chilling detail. He would establish evidence of my infidelity, file for divorce citing adultery, and use my supposed affair to claim the majority of our assets and primary custody of our children. In his mind, the emotional trauma of the divorce would distract me from looking too closely at our finances, and by the time I recovered enough to ask questions, the money would be long gone. He'd already consulted with a divorce attorney. I found copies of their email exchanges, discussing strategy and timeline. The attorney had advised David to document everything, to create a clear pattern of suspicious behavior that would support his claims in court. The fake email to Richard wasn't a moment of jealous rage. It was a calculated move and a carefully orchestrated plan to destroy my life. But David had made one crucial mistake in all his scheming. He'd assumed I was too trusting, too technologically naive, too emotionally dependent on him to fight back. He'd underestimated the woman he'd married, and that underestimation was about to cost him everything. I printed out every document, every screenshot, every piece of evidence I'd found. Then I called my own attorney, a sharp family lawyer named Maria Rodriguez who came highly recommended. When I walked into her office the next morning with 3 bankers' boxes full of evidence, her eyes went wide. "Sarah, I have to ask, how did you obtain all of this information?" "From our shared computer," I replied. "The computer my husband set up and insisted we both use. He gave me full access to everything on it, and technically, since we're still married, his financial records are my financial records too." Maria smiled grimly as she began reviewing the documents. "Your husband made a very expensive mistake. Not only do we have evidence of his embezzlement and his plan to defraud you in the divorce, but his own surveillance activities may have violated several privacy laws. This isn't just grounds for divorce, this could be grounds for criminal charges." While Maria began building our legal strategy, I had one more thing I needed to do. I needed to confront David, but not in the way he was expecting. I wasn't going to play the role of the devastated, confused wife anymore. I was going to let him know exactly what I'd discovered, and I was going to watch his carefully constructed world crumble, just like he'd tried to destroy mine. I sent him a text. "David, I know about the money. I know about your clients. I know about the exit strategy. We need to talk. Tonight. Come home." His response came back almost immediately. "I don't know what you're talking about." But I knew he'd be there. David's arrogance wouldn't let him stay away. He'd want to know how much I'd figured out, how much damage control he needed to do. He'd want to try to manipulate the situation one more time. What he didn't know was that I'd already won. The evidence was already in my attorney's hands. Copies were stored in a safety deposit box he didn't know about, and I'd even sent summaries to several trusted friends with instructions to contact the authorities if anything happened to me. David thought he was the mastermind, but he'd been playing checkers while I'd learned to play chess. And now it was my turn to make the final move. When he walked through our front door that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open, surrounded by printouts of his financial records and screenshots of his surveillance activities. The look of shock and panic that crossed his face was almost worth the months of betrayal and manipulation I'd endured. "Hello, David," I said calmly. "Let's talk about your project planning." David stood frozen in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, his eyes scanning the documents spread across our kitchen table. I watched as his face went through a series of emotions: surprise, fear, calculation, and finally, a cold anger that I'd never seen before. This was the moment I realized I'd never truly known the man I'd married. "You went through my private files," he said, his voice eerily calm. "Those were password protected. With the same password you used for everything else," I replied, matching his tone. "Or anniversary date." Not very creative for someone who supposedly works in IT security. He moved closer to the table, and I instinctively tensed. For the first time in our marriage, I felt physically threatened by my own husband. David had always been gentle, never raised his voice, never showed any signs of aggression. But the man standing in my kitchen felt like a stranger wearing my husband's face. "You don't understand what you're looking at, Sarah," he said, settling into the chair across from me. These are business documents, consulting contracts. Nothing illegal about any of it. I slid one of the bank statements toward him. Then explain why Morrison Industries paid your shell company $50,000 for network security consulting, when Richard Morrison told me they've never hired any outside IT contractors. David's jaw tightened, but he didn't break eye contact. Richard wouldn't necessarily know about every vendor contract. Different departments handle different aspects of their IT infrastructure. I had to admit, he was good. Even caught red-handed, he was sticking to his story with impressive conviction. But I'd had days to prepare for this conversation, and I wasn't going to let him talk his way out of what I'd discovered. What about Hartwell Logistics? I continued, sliding another statement across the table. $35,000 for data migration services. Except Hartwell Logistics went out of business 3 years ago. I checked with the State Business Registry. Their corporate charter was dissolved, but somehow they kept paying your consulting fees. For the first time I saw a crack in David's composure. His eyes flicked to the document, then back to my face. He was calculating, trying to figure out how much I actually knew versus how much I was guessing. Companies outsource their final data archiving even after dissolution, he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments before. It's more common than you think. I leaned forward, meeting his gaze directly. David, I called the bankruptcy trustee who handled Hartwell's dissolution. Their data servers were wiped and sold for scrap metal 2.5 years ago. There was no data to migrate. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the wheels turning in David's mind, trying to craft another explanation, another lie that might somehow salvage his position, but we both knew he was caught. How long have you been stealing from your clients? I asked quietly. I'm not stealing anything, he snapped, and there was the anger I'd been expecting. I provide legitimate services. If companies want to pay premium rates for specialized consulting, that's their choice. Specialized consulting like creating fake email accounts to frame your wife for adultery. The question hung in the air between us like a loaded weapon. David's face went completely blank, and for a moment I wondered if I'd pushed too far. But then something shifted in his expression, and when he spoke again, his voice was cold and calculating. You're having an affair, Sarah. I have the evidence. You sent that email to Richard yourself, and now you're trying to deflect by making wild accusations about my business. I never sent that email, and you know it. I replied firmly. You composed it yourself. I found the drafts, David. All 47 versions, saved in your project planning folder. You spent weeks perfecting the wording to sound like my voice. The color drained from his face, but he continued his denial. Those aren't drafts of emails. They're templates. For work presentations. I opened my laptop and turned it toward him, displaying one of his draft emails. Template for a work presentation that starts with Richard. I can't take it anymore. What kind of presentations are you giving? David stared at the screen for a long moment, and I could see the exact instant when he realized his game was over. His shoulders sagged slightly, and when he looked back at me, the mask had finally slipped away completely. You want to know the truth, he said, his voice now carrying a bitter edge. Fine. Yes, I sent that email. Yes, I've been monitoring your communications. And yes, I've been planning to leave you. But not for the reasons you think. I felt my heart racing, but I kept my voice steady. Then why don't you enlighten me? David leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely defeated. Because I've been living with a woman who doesn't even know me, 15 years of marriage, and you never once questioned where our money was coming from. You never wondered how we could afford this house on our salaries, or private school for the kids, or those expensive vacations. You just accepted it all without thinking. His words hit me like a physical blow. Are you seriously trying to blame me for not knowing you were a criminal? I'm not a criminal, he said firmly. I'm an opportunist, and I'm very good at what I do. But living with someone who's so willfully ignorant about the realities of our life, it gets exhausting. I stared at him in disbelief. So your solution was to steal money, frame me for adultery, and destroy our family. My solution was to build a new life where I wouldn't have to pretend to be someone I'm not, he replied. The fake affair was just the cleanest way to make that happen. You'd get sympathy, I'd get freedom, and the kids would be better off with me since you'd be the one who broke up the family. The casual cruelty of his words took my breath away. This wasn't the passionate crime of a jealous husband, or the desperate act of someone in financial trouble. This was the calculated manipulation of a sociopath who'd been planning to destroy my life for his own convenience. And what about our children? I asked. What about Emma and Michael? They love you, David. How could you do this to them? For the first time in our conversation, I saw genuine emotion cross his face. The kids will be fine, better than fine. They'll have financial security, stability, and they won't have to watch their parents' marriage fall apart slowly over the years. They'll have a father who's going to prison for embezzlement, I said flatly. David laughed, but there was no humor in it. Prison? Sarah, you still don't get it, do you? I've been very careful. Every transaction I've made has been technically legal. Overpriced, maybe. Ethically questionable, perhaps. But not criminal. Even if you turned over every document on this table to the authorities, the worst that would happen is I'd have to pay some back taxes and penalties. I smiled then, and I could see it unnerved him. David, do you remember what you always used to tell me about backing up important data? His brow furrowed. What does that have to do with anything? You said always keep multiple copies in different locations. So I did. I reached into my purse and pulled out a flash drive. Every document, every screenshot, every piece of evidence I found is on here. But more importantly, I spent the last 3 days calling every single one of your supposed clients. David's face went white. What did you tell them? I told them the truth. That my husband had been billing them for services that were never provided, using defunct companies to process payments, and inflating invoices with fabricated line items. Turns out several of them had been wondering about some irregularities in their IT service charges. I could see panic starting to creep into David's eyes. Sarah, you don't understand what you've done. These are my clients. My livelihood. We're your clients, I corrected. Morrison Industries fired you this afternoon. They're also conducting a full audit of every payment they've made to your company in the past 3 years. Hartwell's bankruptcy trustee is reopening their case based on evidence of fraudulent claims against the estate, and the IRS received a very detailed report about undeclared income from several sources. David's hands were shaking now. For the first time since this nightmare began, he looked truly afraid. You can't do this. We're married. Spousal privilege means you can't testify against me. Spousal privilege protects confidential communications between spouses, I replied. It doesn't protect evidence of crimes discovered through other means, and it certainly doesn't apply when those crimes were committed against the spouse herself. I stood up and walked around the table until I was standing directly in front of him. David, you made one critical error in all your planning. You assumed I'd be too devastated by the fake affair to think clearly. You thought I'd be so focused on saving our marriage that I wouldn't question anything else. But you know what actually happened when I thought I was losing you? He looked up at me, his face pale and drawn. It made me realize how little I actually knew about the man I'd married. And once I started looking for answers, I found a lot more than you ever intended me to see. David buried his face in his hands. What do you want, Sarah? Money. I can make this right. We can work something out. What I want, I said quietly, is for you to pack your things and leave. Tonight. I've already filed for divorce, and my attorney has prepared restraining orders if necessary. You're going to sign over full custody of the children, and you're going to cooperate fully with the financial investigations. In exchange, I won't push for the maximum criminal charges. He looked up at me with desperate eyes. And if I don't agree? I walked over to the window and looked out at our quiet suburban street, the life we'd built together that had all been a lie. Then I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who you really are. Your remaining clients, your family, our friends, our neighbors. I'll tell them about the embezzlement, the surveillance, the fake affair setup, everything. When I turned back to face him, David was already reaching for his phone, probably to call his lawyer. But it was too late for legal maneuvering now. The wheels were already in motion, and there was no stopping what was coming. You have 1 hour to pack, I said. After that, I'm calling the police to have you removed for trespassing. As I watched my husband of 15 years gather his belongings like a stranger in his own home, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not sadness, not anger, but relief. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I could breathe freely. The man I'd loved had never really existed, but the woman I was becoming stronger, smarter, and definitely not as trusting. She was someone I was looking forward to getting to know. 6 months later, I was sitting in my attorney's office as Maria handed me the final divorce decree. David had signed everything without contest. He didn't have much choice after 3 of his clients pressed criminal charges and the IRS froze his hidden accounts. How are you feeling about all this? Maria asked, closing the file folder. I thought about her question carefully. 6 months ago, I would have said I felt destroyed, betrayed, lost. But sitting there in that office, holding papers that officially ended my marriage, I felt something entirely different. I feel free, I said, surprised by my own honesty. For the first time in 15 years, I know exactly who I'm married to. Me. David was facing 18 months in minimum security prison for tax evasion and fraud. Not the dramatic justice I might have wanted, but enough to ensure he couldn't manipulate anyone else's life for a while. His client victims would recover most of their money, and my children would still have their college funds intact. But here's the real twist in this story, the part that even surprised me. 3 weeks after David moved out, I received another midnight email. This one wasn't from my boss. It was from David's brother, Marcus. Sarah, I need to tell you something about David that you deserve to know. Can we meet? It turned out that everything I discovered about my husband's betrayal was just the tip of the iceberg. Marcus had information that would have made David's embezzlement look like pocket change. But that's a story for another time. The point is, when someone betrays your trust as completely as David betrayed mine, it changes you. You stop being the person who accepts things at face value. You start being the person who asks questions, who demands answers, who refuses to be anyone's victim. I'm not the same woman who used to share passwords and bank accounts without question. I'm stronger now, smarter, and definitely more suspicious. Some people might see that as tragic, but I see it as evolution. Now I want to know, what would you do if you discovered your partner had been monitoring your every digital move? Would you confront them immediately? Or would you investigate first like I did? Have you ever had that gut feeling that someone close to you is hiding something major? Comment below and tell me your story. Trust me, after what I've been through, nothing will surprise me anymore. And if you're currently in a situation where something feels wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on it, trust that instinct. It might save your life. Hit that like button if you think David got what he deserved, and subscribe for more true stories about betrayal, revenge, and the strength it takes to rebuild your life when everything falls apart. Because sometimes the person you trust most is the person you should trust least.